Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest edition of Office Hours. I am Joe Perfetti, your host. Today, we are going to be talking about grit and resilience. And we have a great panel of guests that are here and experts on resilience and grit. They are all part of the world-renowned Penn that came as graduates from the MAP program. And in just a second, I'm going to ask them to introduce ourselves. This is being broadcast on YouTube Live. And so if you have any questions for the faculty, feel free to put them in the comments and we'll try and answer them as we go along. Ultimately, the purpose of Office Hours is in today's online world, it's usually a one-way conversation. And so what we're doing is we're giving you a chance to engage with faculty, to ask real questions, to talk practically about the issues, and to work through your challenges and share our experiences. So again, Andrew, Chad, Ken, John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So in terms of quick introductions, Andrew, why don't we start with yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Soren. You're hearing from me right now in Toronto, Canada. I am the CEO and founder of a consulting company that is called Eudaimonic by Design. Eudaimonic by Design is really a company that focuses at the intersection of work and well-being, how to create the context to be able to allow people to be their best selves. All the people who I work with are graduates of a program that Joe just talked about, that all of us are part of as well, this program called the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as well. And that's my brief introduction. Maybe I'll pass it on.
Great. Chad?
Hi, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Chad Thomas. I am a senior relationship manager at BetterUp, and also a graduate of the Master of Applied Positive Psychology program at UPenn. And my organization, BetterUp, we're one of the first companies to actually marry positive psychology and real-world business applications through a digital executive coaching ecosystem. And so we're coaching people throughout the entire globe in 62 countries. We're coaching with over 300 enterprise customers. And my focus is to really engage with CHROs, chief strategy officers, on really the fundamental ways that they can shift culture in their organization, and using coaching as one lever in that support ecosystem to make for an incredible employee experience. So really happy to talk today.
Great. Thanks, Chad. And John?
Yeah, hi, John Hallway. I work at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I run a criminal justice reform center there called the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice. I graduated from the MAP program in 2018 as the acronym says, it's the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology. So once I graduated, I began looking at ways to apply positive psychology in various types of organizations. So I'm a senior fellow at Penn's Positive Psychology Center, which gives me an access to do research and continue to develop the themes of how organizations can benefit from positive psychology. And I'm working on implementing positive psychology curricula at the law school and in the university as large, but I also consult with primarily professional services organizations, law firms, and other services organizations on ways to improve employee and management engagement, ways to reduce burnout, and other ways to implement positive psychology so that the organization and the people within it are able to design careers of thriving and flourishing.
Great. And Ken?
Hello, Ken Shainman, and I have been a consultant, software entrepreneur, director of one of the largest summer camps in the United States, and most recently the executive director of the International Positive Education Network and US and IPEN US. The goal and focus is to bring the insights from the science of well-being into schools, to orient schools not just toward academic achievement, but toward the growing and development of the skills for well-being and thriving and achievement with kids.
Great. And so again, welcome. So as we get started today, I know that the topic is going to be on grit and resilience. And all of you are colleagues of Angela Duckworth, who worked on grit and applied all this material. But the word that you've been using in all of your introductions is positive psychology. And just for my benefit and the benefit of our listeners, what's the difference with positive psychology and why is it so relevant today?
I'll start on this one. You guys jump in. Most of the history of psychology has focused on illness, on depression, anxiety, things that go wrong with people, and how do you fix them. Positive psychology simply inverts the question. Positive psychology looks at people's strengths and capabilities and says, what can we do to foster those? We don't only have to look at people who might be suffering. We can also improve the lives, improve the effectiveness of those who really are in any stage of life, any category of life, and any enterprise. And looks at both the individual and the enterprises themselves.
Okay. What else is different? Anybody else want to jump in?
Well, let me mention one thing that I think really is important, which is there's a difference between what we'll be talking about today as positive psychology and sort of inspirational speaking, which is that the positive psychology is using the tools of science, the tools of psychology that were used for 50 years to look at pathologies in people and problems, and taking those same tools and asking, how can we design a life of flourishing and thriving? So the things that we'll be talking about, and certainly the stuff that Angela talks about in resilience and grit, they're all scientifically based. They've gone through clinical studies and evaluation and peer-reviewed publications. So we're talking about data-driven interventions to help people design lives of meaning to themselves, as opposed to just pie-in-the-sky concepts about optimism.
And maybe the only other thing that I'll kind of pile on there is the reality that positive psychology doesn't ignore the hard stuff. It doesn't ignore the problems. And that in many ways, positive psychology is about trying to be able to bring a full perspective of how do people think, feel, and do to the work that any of us do, whether it's in an organization or in our lives. And certainly in the context of this pandemic that we're all living in, there's a lot of really difficult things. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of things that are really challenging for all of us to deal with. And so positive psychology and everything that we're going to be talking about today is not about ignoring those things. It's about being able to say, what else do we need to be able to do to be able to make sure that even in the context of challenge, we're able to live the best lives we possibly can.
All right. So I want to get started and talk about resilience. And we're all Philly guys in one form or another. You guys all went to school at Penn. I went to Wharton. And, I come from an understanding of resilience from what I'll call the Rocky Balboa school, where if I can paraphrase him from the movie, he basically said, it doesn't matter how hard you get knocked down, it's can you get up and keep going. And is that the definition of resilience that you use in positive psychology? And is that the way we should be thinking about resilience as individuals and leaders?
Well, I guess I'll start. That's probably an older view of resilience, and kind of a simplified one. A more modern view on it, and a data-driven, evidence-based view, is resilience is multifaceted. It is how you bounce back and potentially bounce back higher from adversity. When I think of the Rocky Balboa, which is kind of what I grew up with, when things are difficult, you bear down, white knuckle it, and we're going to just push through. That may work for a very small subset of people, but that's by and large not how resilience works, and certainly is not at an organizational, at a team level. So one phrase I like quite a bit is resilience is a team sport. It's not one person struggling by themselves. It really is an element of being interconnected.
Okay.
If I can just add quickly there, resilience is becoming one of the most popular terms now by everyone that's in L&D or that's in the C-suite, because in the face of COVID and everything we have seen with uprisings in the United States, this concept of resilience, people are using as a catch-all to describe a behavior that they want people to be able to manifest. But, like Ken said, very few people can be Rocky Balboa, and that they can get punched in the face by something and really bounce back as quickly. And so resilience really requires a corporate setting. And I don't mean within an organization. I mean having a village or ecosystem of support so that you can figure out what are the people or the things that I can lean on to make sure that I'm able to eventually get back to parity and then get to a state of flourishing. And so one of the difficult things that organizations are facing with today is, how do I build resilience into my new workplace dynamics when everyone is remote? because if you take resilience and then you layer on loneliness, which a lot of people are feeling in the workplace since they can't have a corporate place to gather anymore, a lot of organizations feel stuck. And so that's why resilience is even more critical right now, because I look at resilience as sort of the scaffolding to your own internal structure. And we're seeing that a lot of that scaffolding was weak. People thought that they had the ability to really thrive while working remotely. But then, when you think about COVID, you think about loneliness, a lot of people are feeling stuck and alone. And so organizations are trying to cull or excavate resilience by incorporating different learnings and having speakers come in. But it requires a real consistency of people understanding, how do you define resilience for yourself and how do you incorporate that with some sense of normalcy.
So can resilience be taught, or is it something that's just kind of genetic?
It can definitely be taught. So all of the things that we are going to be talking about today really emerge from a lot of work that's been done at University of Pennsylvania over the last 30 odd years in terms of trying to teach resilience, initially to teachers, to try to figure out how do we build the resilience of young people and students, and then eventually applied in all sorts of different contexts. In fact, Penn's resilience program, which is the formal name of the program, has kind of most famously been used in the context of the U.S. military. So the U.S. Army bought an extraordinary, huge program that has basically taught every single person within the U.S. military, within the U.S. Army, to build specific concrete skills around resilience. So an understanding of the biological factors, for example, how we eat, move, and sleep to be able to increase our physical capacities to be resilient. But then from like a psychological fitness perspective, our capacities for self-regulation, our abilities to think about optimism, are the ways that we think about thinking about problems. Can we think about problems in more flexible, accurate, thorough ways? Can we learn the skills of social support that we need, or even create the context where we believe that we can get through something and we have the self-efficacy to be able to seize a situation? All of these are very teachable and learnable things.
Well, what are the drivers of resilience? I mean, I know I have this data that somebody had sent me before the session. Can somebody help me understand this? Because if I need to learn resilience, what's going to matter?
Yeah, I'd be happy to dive in here. So at BetterUp, we measure this and we care a ton about this, because without knowing the drivers of resilience, it'd be very difficult to manifest it. And so if you think about something like emotional regulation or self-compassion, the reason these are the drivers or catalysts to resilience is because it really requires a lot of internal reflection for you to understand, how do I treat myself in the face of something difficult? Or how am I able to manage my emotional temperament so that when things go up and down during the day, I have that structure to really make sure I can succeed. And something as simple as optimism, that's a huge driver of positive psychological capital, because someone's ability to be able to have some sense of hope, or to be able to look forward with perspective and a positive light towards something that's occurring, all of those are driving, the ability to manifest more resilience. Now, candidly, I think most of us are probably good at 2 or maybe 3 max out of doing those 5 drivers on a day-to-day basis. And so this is not, if you can't do all 5, that means that you're not going to be resilient. It's really determining what do you need to stand with both feet on the ground. And if for you today, it's being more agile cognitively, or it's managing your emotions so that when you're on your 5th Zoom call by 4 o'clock, you're still able to show up with a half smile on your face. It's that noticing and that self-awareness, and that's how you really continue to drive resilience.
So I hear the word optimism, and I also hear the word connection. So Ken, can you talk to me about the importance of social connection here?
Sure. Social connection is absolutely critical. The challenges that when looking at resilience, challenges that you face become larger perceptually if you're alone. There's also an element of momentum. I call it interpersonal flow. When you're doing something with someone, when you're engaged in activity with someone, there's a feeling of making progress, connectedness, and support that increases your productivity and the productivity of the person that you're with. The worst thing to do when you're struggling is to move away from people and over reflect on where you are, what you're doing, or what you're not doing. And that's a recipe for getting stuck rather than moving forward. And that feeling of moving forward is critical.
So in today's world, it seems like we're all alone at home. I mean, look at all of us on this call. So how do we stay connected in that environment besides Zoom? Is that enough, given the research?
Well, yeah, it's a good question about whether or not it's enough. It certainly is challenging, but humans are social creatures, and one of the things that we do when we're under stress is essentially a hormone cascade, and one of those hormones is oxytocin, which is a trust hormone. It's what we use when we induce pregnancy, and in part it's because the woman who's giving birth uses oxytocin as a way to bond with the new child. So when we're stressed out, when we're under uncertain circumstances, our bodies actually impel us with hormones to go reach out and connect to other people. So, it's obviously better to be in person with people. I don't think that Zoom is going to be a be all and end all for that, but it is a way for us to connect that's more direct, that's instantaneous, that helps us keep those relationships going. I don't know if my colleagues are doing what we're doing, but we've got a weekly Quarantinis Zoom call with friends as a way of keeping in touch. And those social interactions have been shown to, social connections and a strong social network has twice the correlation to longevity as smoking has to lung cancer. So it really does matter. And I think, to Chad's point about, I really like your description of scaffolding. For resilience, because I think what you're finding that you can rely on that structure, and in that structure, to Andrew's point, you don't need to not acknowledge. I think this is where we differ from Rocky Balboa. It's not that you're not acknowledging the problems, it's that you're leveraging the structures that you've got to share those problems and engage with them, and in so doing, build that social network that helps you address them.
So how do I manage the stress then? So outside the social network, do I just, go to the gym and take out, I can't go to the gym, I'm barred from gym. Do I get the stress balls? Like what do I do? Any tips for managing stress? Andrew? Or somebody?
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. Stress is such an interesting topic. So first of all, we all have stress, and I think that there's lots of different ways for being able to think about stress. I think that that the science clearly shows, if you have stress, the best things that you can potentially do for stress are to be able to think very deliberately about the ways in which you eat, move, and sleep. It's in many ways those very fundamental, simple things in terms of making sure that we are nourishing our bodies in a way that actually allows us to be able to deal with stress. But even more so, it's even thinking about what stress is. And so there's this researcher whose name is Kelly McGonigal, who talks a lot about stress mindset. Thanks for throwing this up on the slide. And what Kelly talks about, and she's not the only one, but she's probably one of the most famous ones, she's got some great TED Talks out there, is that we can approach stress from two different mindsets. We generally, when we think about stress as debilitating. It's a negative, it needs to be avoided, it's bad for my health. It inhibits my learning. Here we see it's bad for performance. But stress can also be thought of as enhancing. When athletes, for example, think about stress coming into an event, they think about stress as a potentially very good thing. Stress, all of the things that stress does to our body, in many ways enhance our capacity to be able to deal with something. So we can think about stress, if we think about stress as a capacity to help us actually learn and grow. Or something that's getting us ready to really perform in a way that we've never been able to perform before. If we see stress as a way of actually improving our health as opposed to debilitating it, it completely transforms our relationship to stress. And so there's just a huge part about making sure that we're aware as we think about stress in our lives, about the relationship that we have with stress. And when we notice our heart beating faster, do we actually say, could that be helping me in some way right now? If we're feeling an urge to be near friends and family? Is that, just as Ken was talking about, kind of our desire to build social connection in some way, shape, or form? And is that actually our body's natural way of kind of urging us towards the things that we need? So those are some of the ways in which we can think about stress.
So how do I turn good or bad stress to good? Is that what you're about to talk about, Ken?
I was thinking back to someone I know who was a competitive skater, and she found stress debilitating. She would nearly freeze. She was at a very high level, an Olympic level. And the turning point for her was when she recognized that when she felt that, the very first step is a step forward or a step back. The step she took was, instead of, oh no, I feel stress, she switched to, oh good, I feel stress. I care about this. That means I'm energized. That little tweak at that juncture can be enough to, I've been using this myself, feel just a wash of calm rather than the tightening, and an eagerness to move forward and tackle what it is in front of me.
So this is the reframing of the negative to the positive, right? These were some of the steps in the reframing?
Yes, absolutely.
So can you just walk through these really quick?
Sure. Most of us have a pretty keen awareness that we are stressed, especially when there's a change in our stress level. So I may feel okay about giving a presentation, and then as it gets closer, all of a sudden the butterflies start coming in. You feel it bodily. That's when you take a moment. This is the space between you and your thoughts. That's my body signaling that this is something that's important to me. Take that moment, and then this is where I can make a choice. This is my body telling me it's important to me, and my body revving up to perform. Versus this is my body telling me that I can't do this, and I'm going to fail. The obligations and privileges. How is this tied? How is this meaningful? Why is this important? This is a privilege to be here and to be performing and doing this.
I want to pick up on that word, because to me, that also, a lot of people have been talking about meaning and purpose. The privilege to me suggests that. And Chad, I see you nodding your head. So why is that sort of become so important in times of stress and even in the world of COVID-19? Why are we talking about that more?
Yeah, we get really excited about meaning and purpose, at least at some of the work that we do within BetterUp, and actually Marty Seligman as well. When we think about the baseline of positive psychology, this concept called PERMA, the M stands for meaning, and meaning is really important to human beings because intrinsic value is something that we tend to skate over, and then it doesn't happen until we're in our maybe early 50s and we have an ulcer or a stroke because we've been going to the same job that's been stress-inducing for the last 2.5 decades, and we're not sure why. And so companies right now are really studying, how do I extract more meaning from my day-to-day? And how do I ensure that purpose is a key part to what I show up to work? And so we measure about 35 different behavioral dimensions within BetterUp when we look at who people are being coached. And we realize that meaning has this cascading effect, in that if there's more meaning in your life, you have more positive emotion. The anti-inflammatory chemicals in your blood are decreased. With meaning, you have a desire to stay at your organization more. You have more life satisfaction. And so meaning, and how we sort of define it, is it's something that gives you a deep attachment to your purpose. And that's really important right now within the framework of COVID-19, because everyone, when you read the news every morning, seems to be really negative. And so if you have somewhere where you can go every day that gives you a deep sense of meaning, where you can impart something positive, and in fact, you can give more of yourself to something that's a bigger cause, that's really what work is intended to be. And so companies are trying to figure out, how do I provide more meaning and purpose to my employees? And those organizations that can do that in the face of COVID are those that are going to succeed for a pretty long time.
So before we go further, we actually have our first question from our audience. I'm going to go ahead and put it up here. It comes from, it looks like Olivia Geiger. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. But she says, hello all. In your research and experience, what step of the reframe process do people often leave out? How does this impact the overall process success?
So I think actually the first part of the reframe process is often the hardest, and Ken touched on it. That if you think about all the things that stress you out, there is a one-to-one correlation between things that stress you out and things you care about. And so if your first thought is stress is my body giving me a signal that I have an opportunity to impact something that is important to me, I think that does two things, right? One is what's in it for me, and the other is the positive reframe of opportunity. I can engage now in something that will impact something of importance to me. And I think it can be very easy when we're juggling lots of balls, when we've got, the things that we're trying to do when we manage our lives. For me, it's like if I'm on a conference call at work and my cell phone rings and it's one of my kids. That's like the absolute worst for me, because I'm absolutely unwilling to compromise on excellence in both of those avenues. But the opportunity is that's how we live full lives, is by engaging with that struggle and those tensions. And I think for me, the thing that when I'm dealing with all those things that I might forget is that initial step of, wait, this is an opportunity for me to do something that's going to impact something that is important to me and that I care about. And once that happens, then the rest of the reframe becomes to fall into place.
I have one for that as well. What do we leave out? When I'm feeling stress or when I'm feeling negative, things seem impossible. And I can't really believe that simply making a shift like this or taking the moment to do this is going to be effective. I think of it like a piece of paper. It is absolutely razor thin. On the other side is what I'm looking for, but it is utterly opaque. And at any time, I actually have the ability to poke through and go right through the paper, but it seems impossible because I can't see the other side. So that trust, that when I'm feeling stuck, overwhelmed, when this doesn't seem possible, when I'm feeling highly stressed, it's not going to change. That emotion creates the cognitive that says things aren't going to change. I can't do it. And there's a moment of trust and leap of faith that, you know what, that's where the piece of paper is. It's right on the other side. Move forward, poke through. That's where the answer lies.
So as you guys are answering this question, I'm reminded that when I was young, I always had this saying to myself, if you could believe it, you could achieve it. And I think you guys talk about optimism. Why is that so important in grit and resilience? Andrew?
I can start. Yeah, sure, I'll start. So, I mean, in the research around what the most resilient people do, I think that the number one finding is that the most resilient people are actually very capable of having basically what is described as an optimistic explanatory style. But really what optimistic explanatory style means is the story that we tell ourselves in our heads. So this is another opportunity to think about reframing, right? So when bad things happen to us, we generally look at things one of two ways. A generally pessimistic way of thinking and explaining things that are bad to ourselves is that it's my fault. That this project that I'm working on right now failed, and it failed because I did something wrong. I didn't have the skills to do it. It was my fault. Also, pessimistic people tend to say it's everything. Like everything that I touch always seems to turn out to be a disaster. That's a frequent thing that we hear out of pessimistic people. And that it's not just in this pandemic period of time. It's just that if I think about everything past, present, and future, things are always going wrong for me. That me always everything narrative is very characteristic of what the most pessimistic people tend to think about the world. Whereas optimists really are very capable of saying, this project failed, and it failed because of a very specific context. In the context of this pandemic, in the context of right now, I just wasn't able to achieve it. It's not that everything failed, it's that this specific project failed. And it's not my fault. There were like a dozen of us who were involved in this project, and we all had some relatively kind of equal contribution into what happened here. The people who say it's not me, it's not always, it's not everything, those people tend to, when bad things happen to them, have this what's called optimistic explanatory style, and the optimists are the ones who are able to bounce back better. They're able to approach adversity and be able to basically say, I can learn and grow from this. I can try to figure out. So it's another opportunity to think about the reframing that Ken was describing earlier. Is how do we approach a problem and kind of reframe in our head what's possible in that context?
Guys, do you think that optimism gets a bad rap? Or I often think of that person's an optimist, not a realist.
Yeah, the Pollyanna-ish kind of quality.
Pollyanna, yeah.
Well, I mean, we know that there's a negativity bias, right? And going back, just evolutionarily, if you're walking through the woods and you ignore a wolf, the downside of ignoring the wolf is much more severe than the downside of ignoring a rainbow, right? So we're going to be primed to prioritize the negative information in our lives because that information is the downside risk stuff that we're protecting ourselves against. Whereas we might not pay as much attention to positive stuff because if we ignore that, it's still positive, but it's not like there's a big downside risk. So you got to be aware of that negativity bias. What I like about your quote, Joe, is the belief that things are going to get better if I do things, right? The belief that I can impact my future and make things better is an essential component of optimism and you can see easily how it feeds into resilience, right? So you've got to, the explanatory speaking style are techniques for reminding yourself about that realistic optimism. Life is not all unicorns and rainbows, but it's not, but you have a bias already for the wolf. And so what we're talking about is a way to try to balance out the scales, because if you just think about the bad stuff, you're not going to be enabled cognitively to be really thinking objectively about what you can do to improve. And that belief structure that you can tell yourself is a path to getting there.
So what would be some things, some pragmatic, actionable things that a leader can do, might start doing tomorrow that could put this into practice? I can think of just one that I used to do on performance evaluations or discussing a project. Oftentimes there was an equal balance of here are the things you're doing right, here are the things you can work on. Or it might be one thing you're doing right, or things you can work on, or no things you're doing right, and just the things that you need to work on. So we flip that around and force people who are the managers to write down on 5 separate lines, here are 5 things that you're doing exceptionally well, and 1 or 2 that you're working on to kind of start to rebalance that negativity bias. What might be some other things?
Well, I think this is a great way to answer this question, and one I just saw in the comment. I think someone, Senya Mamin, asked, hey, what's the simplest resilience skill you'd like to teach people? Something they can get really quickly. What I'd say is 2 things, and this is in the context of work. Avoid thinking traps, right? And that's something that you can do really quickly and really simply. And a thinking trap basically is any thought pattern or process that leads you to an outcome of just sheer bleakness and negativity. So, managing a difficult conversation, that takes a lot of resilience. So if your direct report or a colleague that you're working with is consistently doing something that requires you to address that or confront that, that's not fun for a lot of people. And a question that you can ask yourself is, where are my thoughts going with respect to this person? And what's like just taking the simple step of actually just breathing, getting some more oxygen into your brain and thinking about what is the outcome that I want to have from this interaction or with this project or with this email. And asking yourself a reflective question is a great way to get your mind to start to reframe how it's going to attack something. And that ability to reframe a question and to assess its actual value is a great way to build resilience. If you think about, the things that we deal with in the workday, both large and small, there are a ton of things that I come up against. But my ability to be resilient is to assess its value. If I'm talking to an organization and, they have something negative to say about positive psychology, how do I, as a structured person, use resilience to say, hey, what is this conversation actually worth to me in the long run? And how do I lead this conversation as the best version of myself? So to distill it, reframing, asking reflective questions and assessing the value of something, I think, is a great way to co-resilience.
I was talking to a leader the other day, Chad, just in that spirit, who was talking about the have to get to paradigm, which I thought was like a really great and simple way of thinking about it. Was just, there's so many things in our lives where we, especially these days, where it feels like, oh man, I have to do this, I have to do that, we have this kind of burden of responsibilities that we're facing with that can feel so overwhelming. But within that burden of responsibilities, what are the things that you actually get to do? What are the privileges of being able to spend more time with your kids than you've ever been able to potentially spend before? What are the ways in which you get to share your passion about positive psychology with a client instead of thinking about, I have to defend positive psychology to somebody in some sort of a way? What are the opportunities of, like, I can't go into the office, I have to work from home, but I also get, an extra 2 hours of time that are non-commute time that I can now try to figure out how I can do something productive with. So just that kind of that simple, in how can I shift from I have to I get to? That would be my answer, Senya. Nice to see you.
Salespeople are very good at this. Yeah. Very good salespeople. The no is not putting the brakes on something. The no is an opportunity to, they just don't understand this yet, and move forward.
That reminds me that of Seligman's the guy who did most of the research on optimistic explanatory style, and he did a lot of the work. He did some really seminal studies on salespeople themselves, and by far and away, the salespeople who were most successful were the ones who had the optimistic explanatory style.
So here's another question, which has come up a number of times with companies I'm working with, including on another webinar I was on this morning, which is, and I'll paraphrase, but in the age of COVID, things that used to be on companies' drawing boards that would be 2 to 3 years out, people have figured out how to do in 2 weeks. And just that's kind of the metaphor. So how does this apply to what we're talking about, to what's causing that level of acceleration, that level of improved performance under stress, that level of being under the gun and suddenly companies do? Like, why is that happening, and how do we sustain it so that we get beyond this when we're not in COVID and be able to do things at a much faster rate?
Well, go ahead, Chad.
All right, go ahead, John.
Well, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of things happening simultaneously here, but one of the things that I found really inspiring in this process have been the individual ways that people are finding to make contributions to the community, to the group, whether it's your neighborhood or your company, right? People are reaching out to other people and they're aware of the challenges, and to push through those challenges, people are making individual outreach and checking on each other. So I think there's a certain amount of everybody comes together in a crisis that's happening. And in companies that have strong leadership, that facilitates that sort of, hey, we're all in it together. We're not sure exactly how this is going to last. So what we're going to do is we're going to do individual things one at a time. We're going to check in with each other. We're going to figure out how to solve these problems. And that galvanizes a team spirit, that sense of meaning, that sense of optimism, and brings those people together. And it creates areas for the airing of stresses and things that we can then deal with. So I think that enables problem-solving behavior. And so in some sense, again, as long as we're reframing things, right, I do think that COVID is a catalyst for creativity as we approach this new problem. And that gives us some ability to solve those problems in a new way, and to be forced to look at things in different ways that otherwise we could have just allowed to go. But Chad, I didn't mean to talk over you earlier.
No, to add on to an incredible explanation, stress breeds creativity, and that your back is against the wall, you have to find new ways to continue to produce. The unfortunate, or the other side of that, is because people are working from home right now, while we're seeing productivity go up, we're also seeing well-being go down. And that's because when you're at the office, so to speak, is my office here, is my kitchen. And so my ability to sort of turn it off is really difficult, because there's not a physical proximity between work and home anymore. They've been conflated. And that's what a lot of organizations, or really athletes, there's something called the vigilance decrement. And it's a really fancy way of saying, how do I sustain a level line? And so if you think about Usain Bolt, he does the 100-meter dash sprint. If he was supposed to do the 100-meter dash sprint for a mile, there's no way he could maintain that vigilance decrement, meaning that without him taking a break, he's not going to be able to sustain that performance over time. And the problem now of organizations are they're expecting people to have the same output, if not more, while they're working remotely. But when you're working remotely, if you're a parent, you have your children, you have your home, which is a different psychological environment. So the expectation for leaders that people can sustain high performance while working remotely it's a really tough dynamic. And so organizations are just realizing that working parents are a real thing, and it really does impact your productivity. So how do we set up dynamics and environments so that people can still perform without their well-being being at risk?
There's another element, or two elements actually, to do with growth mindset. So we're being forced to change. That's the circumstances around us. And growth mindset is the belief that my intelligence, my capabilities are not fixed. This is not who I am. And with a growth mindset, my skills, my traits are malleable. That tends to put focus on what I'm doing rather than how well I'm doing it. If we're going to have rapid change, it's going to involve failure. And wise leaders are going to not only make it okay to have wise experimentation failure, or prudent, I should say, experimentation failure, but we're going to recognize it and give equity to the people who are trying things that may potentially succeed, and don't, which can catalyze socially others in a team or an organization to do the same. Leaders also have to be prudent about where are the areas where we want to encourage that and where are the hard lines. So I used to be a summer camp director. When it came to special events and special days, sky's the limit. Let me see how creative you can be. You have a zany idea, run with it. If it had to do with the safety of children, if in that event there was something that might be unsafe, that's a hard stop no. So to have people be clear about where those boundaries are, of where I really want you to try, and you're going to get an enthusiastic pat on the back for having tried and have it not work, versus that's an area that really shouldn't be touched, that has potentially too much of a negative impact on the organization or team.
So in this environment where it almost seems like you're working 24/7, how do you prevent burnout?
Yeah, that's a really important issue. And I think I tend to think of burnout and engagement on a spectrum. Burnout can be thought of as a job or a project that is actually taking your energy away from you, whereas engagement is going to work and having that energy come to you. And when we talked about meaning, right, one of the ways that we get engagement from our work is the narrative about why that work matters. And for a lot of us, our work matters now because of all the things that people are struggling with, right? Now more than ever, we need to step up and do X, Y, Z. And meaning and both and mattering too. So it's not only does my work have meaning, but I have meaning in the work, right? I matter to the work. So those two components, I think are both important. And I think one of the things that leaders need to do is convey both that the work matters and that the people doing the work matter too, that the work doesn't get done without you, personally, and without this team doing things. And when you can provide that sense of engagement, so that there's two parts in my mind. One is that sense of engagement. The other is, if you think about, you can think about COVID as a marathon or any sort of ultra endurance contest. And the fact of the matter is, if you're running a marathon, the task is, how do I sustain my energy for the 26 miles plus that I'm going to need to do? When you don't know where that finish line is, that can be really tricky, because now you don't know how to sustain your energy because you don't know how far you've got to go. The trick, I think, at that point, and this is actually the goal gradient mechanism is what this is called in psychological terminology. The trick then is to do two things. One is small bites, right? One step at a time. I don't have to go 26 miles. I have to go a 1/10 of a mile. And then after that, I'm going to go another 1/10 of a mile. And then I'll see how I'm doing at that point. The other thing is acts of generosity. When we start thinking about what we're doing in terms of how it helps other people, that adds energy, meaning, and inspiration to what we do. So the two things to do are to say, we're not going to worry about the uncertain future. We're going to worry about the small things we can control in ways that help us help others and help each other go. And that facilitates that sort of team spirit that helps push things along and reduce burnout.
What's a pylon? Oh, before Jack.
What I'd say really quickly is one thing that a lot of people don't think about with burnout is negligence. And that's negligence of the self and negligence of those around you. If you are not paying critical attention to your body and to what your brain is saying and repeating to yourself, that form of negligence is what often can lead to burnout. And so if I'm not paying attention to my wife, if I'm not paying attention to how my colleagues respond on calls, then that form of negligence is going to result in burnout. And the challenge to many of us is, am I being negligent when it comes to my well-being? Am I being negligent when it comes to managing my team's well-being? Because you can recognize patterns when someone is exhausted. And that's either in their tone, that's in the quality of their work. And so, woeful optimism is thinking that something's going to get better. That's not a great strategy, right? It's paying attention and taking action.
I want to just double down on what Chad has said, because I think that when we think about burnout, we can often think about these positive psychology resources as things to help people just get through it and weather the storm. I think there's a bigger kind of systemic question about, are we as people who lead organizations or craft or design the context for people's jobs actually helping to make sure that we are not contributing to the burnout, or are we just giving people tools to kind of bomb the pain, to make it irrelevant? So for example, the use of mindfulness has often been used in work or organizations to give people who are stressed the opportunity to just kind of chill out, get through it, and find a way to work even harder. And I guess the question becomes at a certain point an ethical question, as at what point do we have to say, wow, are we creating the conditions for people that actually allow them to work less? I was just looking at a Microsoft report that came out in HBR this morning about a study that they've done over the amount of time that people are working at Microsoft, and consistently everybody's work week has increased at least 4 hours over the course of the pandemic. And some of that is for very good reasons in terms of people creating greater flexibility and working in non-traditional hours. But at the same time, are we creating expectations that are ultimately helping people deal with burnout, or are we creating conditions that are ultimately enabling people to only have to work harder?
And
Go ahead, Ken.
Joe, you started by talking about meaning and burnout. People are willing and energized to work exceptionally hard and in ways that tend not to burn one out, if they feel that what they're doing is meaningful and that they're having, again, that impact. I think about some of the Adam Grant studies, putting a picture on a radiological scan increased the amount of time that the radiologists spend on the scan, as well as the accuracy, dramatically. Similarly, when students were working in call centers, calling alumni for donations, when they had a student who was a beneficiary of that come and give a 5-minute talk to those who were doing it, the amount of time per call increased dramatically, as did the amount of revenue that they were able to generate. And that was replicated. One of them, the revenue generated was 400%. It's a tedious, awful job with lots of rejection, but attaching that meaning. And in one of these studies, I think this was one with editors, there's a difference between a leader explaining that this is meaningful and why, versus the tangible or more visceral feeling that they got, that the participants got from seeing someone who was a beneficiary, or in this case, a video of someone who was a beneficiary. The leadership making that connection, the leader explaining that connection increased the efficiency about 3%. Seeing that video of someone who was actively helped in their thesis by quality editing increased the rate of catching errors by 37%. So if a manager has, and this is creativity, can find ways to more viscerally attach people to what the outcomes of what they're doing, their contribution, why the big picture matters and why their small contribution or their small piece of it matters, that can go a long way.
No, this is terrific and I think very useful. So I know we're going to be coming near the end of our time here, about 8 or 9 minutes. But one other topic that was on our list that a lot of companies have been dealing with is the notion of creating safe spaces. It's been in the news. It's been on a lot of corporate boardrooms. Why is that important, and how do you do it?
So this is actually something that we do in the criminal justice world in my work at Penn Law. So we look at cases in the criminal justice system where things have gone horribly wrong, a death in custody, for example. And it's really important to be able to create an environment where people can come and talk about those things so that you can learn from them. And I use that as just an example of how, why you need a safe space. But it goes much broader than that in an organizational context. So Google actually did a study throughout their organization of why some of their teams got great performance results and other teams didn't succeed as well. And the single biggest characteristic among the teams that succeeded in their goals or exceeded their goals was this concept of psychological safety, the idea that it was okay to risk, say things that were risky, generate ideas, throw things out there. And that feeling of safety, that feeling that you could say whatever you needed to say or wanted to say in constructive ways within the group, but that if you said something dumb, that wouldn't get penalized, and that your input was valued even if you didn't hit the mark on every target. That was actually the most important characteristic of team succeeding. So if you're leading an organization, the reason this is important is because people generate more ideas. Right? So if people feel safe volunteering things, if they feel comfortable taking risks, you're going to get the more ideas generated. And when you get those more ideas generates more value. It's a pretty straightforward thing from there. So figuring out how to create an environment where people feel comfortable taking risks makes the difference often between the idea that breaks a project open and kind of continuing to run in place.
And to double click there too, at our organization, with all the teams at BetterUp, we measure psychological safety when we do our cultural caucus surveys. And that's probably the most important metric and leading indicator for the success of the team, and frankly, the longevity of the team. And we actually have this term that we call brave spaces, because what it really requires is a lot of vulnerability for someone to actually speak up. And right now across the country, in fact, across the world, we're seeing organizations create these brave spaces for people to share their stories, to share their ideas. But I think your original question of, creating safe or brave spaces, it's really about people's ability to be seen. And whether you are from a marginalized community or not, everybody wants to be seen. And that's really hard to do in a all hands setting in a town hall. But if you're intentional as a leader and you create, dyadic environments where two people can share their story and get understanding, that's an incredible, I'd say, starting point to transforming culture at an organization. And if there's a culture where if I can say something to John, and it might not be politically correct, it might not be grammatically correct, but it is my story, and he can respond back in a way that is showing empathy and compassion, you've done something incredibly unique. But what we are doing as organizations is we're calling these things safe spaces, and they're really not. A safe space is grounded in confidentiality and intentional surrounding, usually I'd say 2 to 3 people max to have a dialogue that might be sensitive, and making sure that those people feel seen as an outcome. And being able to do that at scale is really hard. But I think that's one of the key tenets to once again, elevating the employee experience.
Before we go, can I go back, Chad? You said you measure it as a leading indicator. So if I'm listening to this, what can I measure in my organization that's a leading indicator? Because I just want to be very clear on that, because it seems very helpful. What can we actually measure?
Yeah. Oh man, I'd say for what I think psychological safety is really important.
But how do you measure that? How do you measure that?
Yeah. So what we do at our organization is, without sort of going underneath the hood, is we have a few Likert scale questions that Likert scale items that we ask, like, when it comes to presenting a new idea on my team, I feel that the team will respond in a way that's helpful. I feel that I can come to my team with something that I am uncertain about without the idea being rejected. I feel a sense of shared vulnerability when presenting sensitive items, right? And so those are some of the ways that you can sort of ask it. But I think psychological safety is really important. Values, that's a huge thing that people don't actually think about. Organizations create values, right? Like they have their 5 competencies, but values are very subjective. My experience growing up in the inner city of Newark, New Jersey, and cascading through different environments in my life, that's going to have me with a particular set of values, which might be different than Ken, which might be different than you, Joe. And so we can understand people's values, and then psychological safety, which creates that trust climate. I think if you can do those two, you're about 2 light years ahead of most organizations.
Joe, you can even do something very, very inexpensive and ad hoc and create your own network diagram within an organization. If you ask employees, who are 3 people who I feel particularly comfortable sharing ideas with, being myself with, who are people who are energizing, and list 4 or 5, 3 or 4, and who are some people who I feel less open with, where I feel that my ideas are less appreciated and accepted. That can help you. Now this all has to be very confidential, but that can help you make a diagram within your organization to pinpoint who are the people who are really doing this well, and who are the people who need some extra coaching in this, where might be the problem areas. And the productivity, Kim Cameron out of Michigan or Michigan State?
University of Michigan. Yeah.
Michigan. He's done wonderful work on this, looking at the productivity levels of those people who are close to the dense networks, the dense trust networks, the dense information sharing networks, and in particular, the energizing networks. Who are the people I feel most energized around? Who are the people who it takes energy being around? The productivity impact of being close to the energizers was about 4.5 times those of the high trust and high information sharing.
Great. Well, I see we're and this has been a great conversation. We're getting to the top of the hour, and we're going to have to let everyone go. But before we do, the final thing I like to do in these office hours is to ask each of you to just give one simple rule based on this conversation, or just based on your experience, that people could take away with, that you just think is just something that's a good learning nugget that you can pass on. And I'll let anybody volunteer to start this one, but we'll just get one from each of you, and then we'll wrap up our show. So any volunteers to start first? Your simple rule on resilience,
I got.
Go ahead, Ken.
I have to translate this into a rule, but as John talked about negativity bias, threats scream and opportunities whisper. We have a tendency to gravitate toward the worst thing that someone's done, their worst trait, the worst element of this idea, the worst element of my organization. So for me, taking a pause as I think about things and things that are going wrong is to try to balance it out. So if there's someone and there's something that I don't like about that person, rather than label that person or marginalize or avoid, take that extra moment to say, okay, let's get a 3-to-1. This is the thing I don't like about this person. What are 3 things that this person does very well? I think can be very helpful. This project is driving me crazy. what are the 3 benefits that I can find within the project? It's more than looking for a silver lining. It's building in a practice to start to counterbalance the inherent negativity bias that literally all of us have.
Okay, I think wise words. Who else wants to give a simple rule?
I have a really simple rule. What does the best version of myself look like in the situation? And that is a one-on-one with your spouse. That is working out, and whether or not you want to give up for that last 10th of a mile, or it's the work that you do on a project. I think it's a great way, a barometer for success.
Okay.
So I've been using the serenity prayer a lot. The courage to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. I find at times like this, when everything can kind of feel like the pressure's building up, if you can say, that's out of my control, I'm going to let that go. I'm going to focus on this, which I can have some impact on, and I'm going to be okay with that. That level of self-forgiveness and ability to prioritize really helps.
Okay.
And I would just say quickly, listen to the voice in your head and be aware of the things that you're telling yourself and ask, is this helping me or is this harming me?
And I'll just quickly finish up. Don't know how much this relates or not, but be present as much as you can when you're engaged with people. It's so easy to be distracted in today's world. And so on that note, again, I want to thank everybody for joining the panel today. Really appreciate the conversation. If you'd like to learn more or to connect with any of our panelists, join us on the URL for the company is learningcommunities.com. And would look forward to see you on a future edition of Office Hours. So again, the professors have to go back to work, and we are out for the day. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Joe.